Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello and welcome to Musical Talk. I'm the unsinkable Thos, although that claim hasn't yet been tested. I'm going to start today's episode with a question, and a topical one at that. Let me ask you the name of the wreck of the biggest cruise liner in the world. And your answer is... well, if you said Titanic, you're wrong, because actually it's the Britannic, which was the Titanic's sister ship, and survived only until 1916, when it was sunk in the First World War, and indeed went under in a mere 55 minutes. But of course you'd be forgiven for thinking I am talking about the Titanic, one of three ships, the Olympic, the Titanic and the Britannic, which were built by the White Star Line in 1911 and 1912. And you will have spotted that the centenary of the sinking of the Titanic in the early hours of the 15th of April 1912 has just passed, and there has been a worldwide interest in that particular event. And that interest is something that has survived for 100 years. Although the nature of it has changed. And in this episode of Musical Talk today, we're going to be talking about the representations of the Titanic in various musicals, and in particular the Maury Yeston musical Titanic, which was produced in 1997. But I think it's worth touching very briefly on the way that the Titanic story has evolved in the public consciousness since it actually happened. It was in its way, and I don't belittle either of the events I'm going to mention, but it was in its way the equivalent of the 9/11 disaster in the 20th century. It was something no one was expecting to happen and resulted in a huge loss of life which traumatised society. I don't want to make too much of that, but in the sense of what it meant at the time, that is probably the best parallel I can think of. But the story of the Titanic has evolved and changed in the 100 years since it sank. When I was a boy in the 1970s and early 1980s, you have to remember there was no wreck, or rather the wreck hadn't been found. There was no tangible connection with the Titanic. It was a story, it was a historic fact. There were a few survivors, and indeed where I lived in London, we were very close to one of the few elderly survivors of the Titanic, and she had a national presence. She was very strongly of the view that it was a grave, as it indeed is, and therefore it should not be looked for, it should not be found, and it should certainly not be plundered. She wished for the thing to be left alone to rot in the deep in peace, along with her family's friends and relations, many of whom died on that journey. A perfectly understandable position. And up to that point, whilst there had always been interest in the Titanic, it had not in itself been the obsession that it has since become. Yes, there have been films, yes, there's been plenty of cultural references to it, but usually it's about the people, and the Titanic acted as a backdrop, a context, and we'll see that in the way that it's been illustrated in musical theatre over the 100 years. But in 1984, something completely amazing happened. The wreck was located. If you're old enough to remember it, you will remember the absolute surprise at that time. It was an amazing discovery. The Titanic was, for all intents and purposes, lost forever. There was no tangible link, and then suddenly there it was, photographs of it on the ocean bed, still in a remarkably intact state. And I think it's fair to say that since 1984 onwards, the world's fascination with the Titanic has become an obsession, because it's in the last 30 years, really, that we've seen such a build-up of interest in the centenary that we're into now. And of course, the apogee of that, if you like, was the 1997 film by James Cameron, Titanic, currently re-released in 3D. And in the same year, ironically, and before the film came out, Maury Yeston's musical, Titanic, also was first produced on Broadway. But I think these represent very well the change in public perception. It wasn't so much about the Titanic as a context for human interest stories, but the story of the Titanic itself. And since then, there's been a real trouble in representing the story of the Titanic, because in itself it's quite simple. It was a large ship, it hit an iceberg, it sank, and many people died in that instance. That is the narrative of the sinking of the Titanic. It's the size of the ship, the hubris of it being, speech marks, unsinkable, close speech marks, although there is of course a great question mark over whether that claim was ever actually made about the Titanic, certainly before it sank, and of course the number of people who died, the genuine human tragedy of the thing. But all representations since the boat was discovered and the flame of the obsession became stronger burning than ever before, the dramatic representations have been as much about the ship as about the people. And indeed, that has caused all dramatic representations since 1984 to flounder, if you'll pardon the expression, because it's a very difficult balance to find between the people and the ship itself. And we'll be talking quite a lot about that in our review later in the programme of the musical version of Titanic by Maury Yeston. But let's first look at other representations. Well, quite early on, in fact, in 1931, and you have to remember that's within 20 years of the ship going down, the Titanic was used as one of the episodes in a large musical, really a musical play, by Noel Coward called Cavalcade, which was actually the story of a British family between 1900 and 1931. And in the cast was John Mills as a very young man who, at that time, was a musical theatre performer. Some of the songs written by Noel Coward for that musical include 20th Century Blues and the Mirabelle Waltz. But it also was a jukebox musical in that it included other popular songs from those 31 years included in the story, including If I Was the Only Girl in the World. But, as I was saying, contextually, it isn't about the Titanic, it's about a young couple who get betrothed on a ship at sea, which is then revealed at the end of the scene to be the Titanic. It's just one scene in an episodic musical, which is amazingly difficult to portray on stage, and indeed is very rarely revived. I was lucky enough to see it myself at the Sadler's Wells about 10-15 years ago. That's 1931. The next best-known musical representation of the Titanic was The Unsinkable Molly Brown, to which I alluded at the beginning of the episode. Now, The Unsinkable Molly Brown is a musical with music and lyrics by Meredith Willson. And in fact, I'm going to make a quick observation here. Cavalcade and The Unsinkable Molly Brown and Titanic all have the unusual situation of being written by someone who did both lyrics and music in all three cases. As I say, in the case of The Unsinkable Molly Brown, that's Meredith Willson, most famous for The Music Man. And this particular musical, which opened in 1960 and ran for 532 performances, running for 2 years, is a fictionalised account of somebody called Margaret Brown, who survives the sinking of the Titanic. I have to say, it's a complete piece of hokum. It's about a tomboy girl called Molly Tobin, who decides that she's going to marry a millionaire. And as she pops off to apply for a job in a place called Leadville, she meets somebody called Johnny Brown, who she marries, and one of his claims in the local area, it's gold rush time you understand, comes good. And so they get married, they enter the high life in Denver, but they're rather laughed out of that, so they go over to Europe instead. And there in Europe, Molly is such a hit with the royal families, which are all still in existence before the First World War, that she has an argument with her husband Johnny. He storms back to Denver, and she's left alone in Europe. But whilst she is being flirted with and smooched by a character known as Prince DeLong, I'm not sure which royal family he's supposed to belong to, she realises that her true love is in fact her husband Johnny. And so she goes back to Denver by whatever means she can find. And would you believe it, it's the Titanic. However, she survives by getting in one of the lifeboats, no real surprise there, and gets back to Denver where she and her husband Johnny carry on living a happy life. Not much of a story, you might say, and you be right. And I have to say, I don't think it's Meredith Willson's best score either. None of the songs really stand out from it. But once again, you see the example of the Titanic just being an episode in the life story of somebody and merely being a context. In this case, to give the show a very good title. Incidentally, it was turned into a film in 1964 featuring Debbie Reynolds, of all people, who then, many years later, went to star in it again in 1989 when it went on a national tour of America. So those are the two previous Titanic musicals, and as you can see, nothing really about the Titanic in them. That changed completely when Maury Yeston wrote Titanic the musical. And funnily enough, he actually says he was inspired to write it when the wreck was actually found in the early 1980s. And here's what he said about it. What drew me to the project was the positive aspects of what the ship represented. Humankind striving after great artistic works and similar technological feats, despite the possibility of tragic failure. And there's good drama to be found in that, so that's a perfectly reasonable thing. He then continued, also the dreams of the passengers on board. And of course he differentiates between third class, who in his view were going to America for a better life, the second class, who wanted a leisured lifestyle in imitation of the upper classes, and of course the first class, who were there to cling on to their positions and their privilege. As Yeston goes on to say, the collision with the iceberg dashed all of these dreams simultaneously, and the subsequent transformation of character of the passengers and crew had, it seemed to me, the potential for great emotional and musical expression on stage. And I agree with him absolutely on that. And indeed, there's a very interesting song at the very end of the musical where it argues that all class has been stripped away because in the face of death, in the face of a tragedy like that, class has no meaning. So potentially, a great deal of interest there. The question is, did he succeed? Well, we'll be discussing the book of Titanic the musical in a little bit. And it's worth looking a little more at what Yeston was looking at when he developed the story with Peter Stone. He saw the Titanic disaster as being something very specific to the British culture of the time, which he saw as having rigid social class and an absolute faith in progress and civilization through the advance of technology. So he said, in order to depict that on stage, because this is really a very English show, I knew I would have to have a colour similar to the one found in the music of the great composers at that time, like Elgar or Vaughan Williams. This was for me an opportunity to bring in the musical theatre an element of the symphonic tradition, which I think we really haven't had before. That was very exciting. Now, it was in fact a very lucky show. It opened in 1997, and really had dreadful reviews for the most part. However, with a great deal of timing luck, James Cameron's film came out shortly afterwards in the same year, and as the show was still actually being performed, of course, the worldwide interest in Titanic stepped up a gear, and there, ready-made, was a musical already open on Broadway. And so the sudden surge of purchases of tickets allowed it to stay open for another 2 years. And it has since gone on to become a cult hit of some note, and also won the 1997 Tony Award for Best Musical. Interestingly, however, it has never actually been produced professionally in Britain. However, I was lucky to go and see an amateur version at the Churchill Theatre in Bromley, which was being performed on the very day that was the centenary of the iceberg hitting the Titanic, which was the 14th of April. It sank a few hours later, a mere 2.5 hours later, in fact, in the early hours of the 15th. So this, if you like, was a centenary performance. And I saw the show with old friends of Musical Talk, Jerry and Liz Pennell. You may remember them from various discussions, including on Curtains and Troy Boy. After the show, we got together to discuss what we thought was good and bad about it. And of course, so much of the discussion you'll hear will relate to that difficulty I expressed earlier in finding the balance between telling the story of the ship and the people on it. I hope you enjoy this analysis of Titanic the musical. Musical Talk. Jerry, Liz, thank you so much for joining me again.
A pleasure.
Now, we have been to see Titanic the musical, the 1997 musical by Maury Yeston, who wrote the lyrics and the music, and Peter Stone, who wrote the book of the piece. I'm going to start with a question for the two of you. Maury Yeston has said that he was excited by the idea of writing a Titanic musical after the Titanic wreck was found in about 1984. And it finally hit the stage in about 1997, just before the film came out. But he says he saw the story absolutely as a British story, and he wanted to take British musical influences and write a musical based on the style of music of Vaughan Williams. Did you get any sense of this being a musical that was in any way attempting to be British, that was taking British references or culture or anything? How British was Titanic the musical?
I didn't detect any discernible Britishness. I didn't know about that alleged influence by Vaughan Williams. It may be there, and I may be showing my ignorance by not having spotted it. But it seemed to me to be largely an attempt to sort of replicate sort of a bit of Les Mis and a bit of Rodgers and Hammerstein sort of carousel type, big sort of pumping musical numbers to get the blood flowing and the
Brackets,
eyes
forced
tearing.
Emotion.
Forced emotion, that's the stuff. That was the overarching impression I got.
I would agree. I think it was about as British as Dick Van Dyke. And
Actually, with the same flavouring, yes.
yes. And it's completely a 1980s super musical. It is Les Mis, Miss Saigon, and the only British reference possibly is Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Who's, in some senses, one of the least British writers going in.
Yes.
Now that's interesting, but there are, I think, attempts at British musical influences. I should, by the way, explain the Vaughan Williams thing as being, he claims, a symphonic approach to writing music. I'm not qualified to be able to comment on that.
No, and I think that the fact that, as Liz says, since the 80s, this sort of quite symphonic, or in fact since the 70s,
sound,
really, well, and also the sort of very little dialogue and largely durchkomponiert musicals, as in musicals without dialogue.
Yeah, sung through, I believe, is the
yes.
European phrase we like.
I hope I got that right.
I mean, it's not entirely sung through, but you're right, there's not that much.
No, and yeah, it's not entirely, but there's a lot of dialogue over music as well.
Yeah.
So in some ways that's actually quite effective, because you do notice when there's dialogue and no music.
But I thought that was quite poor, because the points when they suddenly stopped the music and just had dialogue with no music, you imagine were meant to be incredibly important bits of dialogue, but I didn't feel that they were.
Mundane.
They were a bit mundane quite often.
Okay, it could have been effective.
It could have been
It can be an effective tool.
Contextually, it can bring things to the fore, but it didn't, yes. There was, I think, an attempt to do a Gilbert and Sullivan number in the middle of the first act, where Etches, who's the chief steward, and much of his crew, or staff at least, were sort of dancing around the first-class passengers. I think the song's called Isn't Everything Fabulous in the Modern World?
What a remarkable age this is.
Essentially the same song, which was orchestrated like a Gilbert and Sullivan, or no, it wasn't orchestrated. I mean, it didn't feel like a Gilbert and Sullivan piece really, but it felt like it was trying. It felt like an American's attempt to write a Gilbert and Sullivan opera by an American who hadn't seen a great many Gilbert and Sullivan. It's a Gilbert and Sullivan by the popular conception of what that is, rather than by what it actually is. Did you feel that? Did you get any GNS resonances at all in that song or anywhere else?
I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say a GNS reference, but it was a bit of a sort of hark back to an old style musical.
More of a chorusy number, certainly.
Yes, exactly. Rather than it wasn't a big number. There were so many big numbers of all sorts that this was just a nice.
And it actually felt like it was an ensemble where the people were singing together, whereas an awful lot of the other musical numbers reflect that kind of 1980s ideas of the ensemble, where, yes, you have three characters singing, but they're all singing about themselves or about their own
collage.
In a collage, yes.
And that
much
wasn't,
better way of putting it.
Yeah,
this was an
integrated...
actual integrated number, yeah.
So let's talk about its Britishness, because essentially the Titanic, although it's going from Britain via Ireland to America, and therefore, those countries are involved, we in this country, quite understandably, see it more as a British story, I think. Maury Yeston has said he was looking for British influences. We've discussed we can't really see that in the music. We couldn't really see it in the narrative either, could we?
No.
The only part of because there are the customers, if you like, the travellers are divided into first, second, and third class, and then you've got the crew. And I would say only the crew seemed to feel more British. The captain felt like a British person, and his top crew did the same. But the rest of it felt actually, it's not half and half. It actually felt a lot more American than British.
I think among the first class, it was almost entirely American.
Millionaires.
Millionaires. There were two middle class couples, one British, one American, and
the Americans were given much more airtime, as it were.
Yes.
Couple.
Yeah.
Yes, and in third class, they were all Irish.
Absolutely.
Exclusively Irish.
To a man and a woman.
And nearly all of them were called Catherine.
Yeah.
Yes.
And considering the writer of this opera musical, must have done
would-be opera.
Would-be opera, possibly, yes. Must have done a lot of research into the Titanic story and who was staffing it. There's no reference to, for example, what is coming out a lot at the moment in all of the centenary commemorations of the Titanic, of the Italian waiters. In everything that is being put on TV or radio at the moment, there is a lot of references to this very particular set of Italian waiters in the first class lounges, and there was no reference to that at all.
Or any other nationalities travelling in steerage. Or anywhere else for that matter.
Anywhere else, but
it's a very American
view,
and going back to the first class, they're all rich, and insofar as the second class American couple are a bit obsessed with the first class. Well, the wife is, yes. Yeah. It's all about money. So there's no sense of a class musical as in an American view of the English class system. There's just first class and second class and third class as it existed on the ship, which is purely a financial distinction.
I think you're right to say that. However, I think there is I think it believes it's being a clever dissection of the British class system, which was a much more malleable and fluid thing than anyone ever seems to agree is the case these days, or was the case. From a modern point of view, but we were saying off the recording that any class structure to survive, it must have malleability and movability up and down. But it seems to be that the idea, I think you make a very good point, that the idea that first, second, and third class on the ship is an exact match for first, second, and third class. Not that we even use those terminologies in real life of the British class structure, mostly populated by Americans, as it turns out.
I mean, there was, to do it justice, there was, in the British middle-class couple...
Genuine class conflict.
There was a bit of class conflict in that the fiancée, with two E's...
The lady.
The lady, yes, was meant to be upper class, but was about to marry below her station.
And indeed, they were running away from the rich or the classy father to get to America, where they could get married without anyone stopping them.
But to be honest, they were such an underwritten couple that
with the best story.
That reference, was sort of perfunctory, really. It could have been
because there's something so interesting there about a woman who is betraying her class, as it would have been seen, and running off with a lower class person. And yet she was portrayed so traditionally, nothing was made of the fact that she is running off with a person below her class, and what that must have meant, and what it would have meant about her as her intellectual life, and so on.
But I would also have to say that this was a 2 hour, probably 2 hour 20 minute, excluding intervals. Felt longer, but 2 hours 20 minutes. It's about the sinking and the voyage of the Titanic. So, in some ways, to sort of expect a long analysis of the British class system would be, or indeed any class system, would be to sort of over-egg the pudding.
Or miss the point.
Or miss the point, except insofar as...
but it would have made it a more interesting musical, because I think that is where this musical really failed, is that it's a history lesson set to music. It tries to tackle every single aspect of the voyage. It tries to tick all of the boxes.
We even learned how many oranges were on board.
We learned how many oranges were on board.
And crystal glasses.
We have repeatedly were told the length of the boat and how many lifeboats there were, and it was full of fact and no human interest.
Well, no, I think it wanted to have human interest, and it couldn't make up its mind what it was going to do, because it could have focused on very few people, and maybe which in a way is, of course, is what the James Cameron film does. It takes a couple of people, and really the whole emphasis is on them, and you get other characters wandering in and out, but it tells a story through a prism. Now, that's not necessarily something I'm keen on, but it could have been an angle to take. Or you go with the grand overview, and this sort of was attempting to do both, and fell...
This is the question. Is it a concept musical? And, the concept would be, here's the history, if it had, it fully, is this the history of the Titanic, which everyone knows hits iceberg, sinks, people die. I mean, that, regrettably, is the narrative. Is there a way of making that an interesting concept musical, or are you then going to pretend it's a human interest story? Which, of course, it can be, because people died and that's horrible. But do you ever escape the idea that the people, even if they share the names of real people, are real people? They were so badly written, they didn't feel like real people. I didn't get the emotional underpinning. We only saw at one stage during the entire show, in the second act, one person cry, and that's a man when he says goodbye to his son for the last time, as the son goes on the lifeboat and he doesn't. No one else bats an eyelid. In fact, they all play cards until they drown, essentially.
Yes, yeah. I took it very well.
Yes, they were, I would say, very stoic chaps all around. So
I feel it's sort of switched a little bit in the middle of the second act from, I don't know what it was trying to do in the first act, but it was just too many facts, one after another, and these little sort of ciphers, and going back to, I'd say it again, ticking boxes, oh look, here's the jolly Irish people in third class dreaming about America being paved with gold, and oh look, here's the upper class people and the boring major who goes on all the time about having been in the Boxer Rebellion, and
about the only British first class character on board.
Yes.
About the only British first
class.
And
a crushing bore.
In the second act, it suddenly becomes very... deliberately trying to tug at your heartstrings, and I think but again it's focusing too much on the the immense scale of the disaster. It's focusing too much on the fact that 1,500 people died, and you do feel sad and the pain of that number of people all dying at once, but also it becomes too big a number to grasp. And I started to resent the emotional impact that the music and the story was trying to pull me into. But I would have been okay with it if it had been focusing a lot more in on just a few couples and the separation. So like that family where the wife and the small son get to go on a lifeboat and the husband didn't. We'd never seen them before.
Not in any real sense, no.
You know, they'd been passing by on the promenade beforehand. But if they had been a focal part of the family of the story, that would have been so much more emotional and had so much more impact at that point.
So which were the successful characters, in your view? I have a strong answer to this already, but I want to hear yours first.
I think there was a sort of central trio of Mr. Ismay, the owner of the White Star Line. Am I right?
In real life, I think he's the son of the owner.
Son of the owner, yes.
But
I
you're
think
right.
He might have just taken over or was just about to take over.
But he represents the ownership, doesn't he?
Yes.
So, yeah.
The engineer, the designer of
Mr. Andrews?
Mr. Andrews.
Who I believe was he Irish or Scottish? I'm not
Irish.
Sure.
I think
He was
meant to
portrayed
be.
as Irish.
Up
Harland and Wolff.
Up to a point, Your Honour.
Yes. And the captain. And I thought...
Captain Smith.
Captain Smith.
Often portrayed as a villain, but not in this.
No.
Often portrayed as incompetent.
But this was a more sympathetic reading. But let's talk about this dynamic then, because funny enough, this is the dynamic I think is the most successful in the whole piece as well. So I'm going to say, carry on.
And certainly in Act 2, I thought by far the most successful number, which comes about a third of the way through the act, was a number where the three of them share recriminations, and then in classic musical style, they each have a short moment in the spotlight, quite literally, where they reveal their sort of inner doubts and say, well, actually, perhaps it was my fault, and then go off. But that was an effective scene because it did sort of bring out at least some of the main sort of themes of the Titanic. You know, in a way, there is a key thing with the whole Titanic disaster tragedy, which I think is a reason why it remains such a hugely resonant event, is obviously partly largely the number of people who died, but also this sort of avoidable tragedy. Yeah. Somebody cocked up big time.
How could a successful ship company and a successful captain and a successful designer steer a ship to death?
I think that's quite a modern revisionist look at them, because it is saying that somehow these things could have been avoided. In the programme notes, for example, it talks about what was meant to be this revolutionary design of the compartments within the hull, and the fact that if these were flooded, it would prevent the rest of the ship flooding. And in the programme notes, it says, it's now actually believed that the design of these compartments might have contributed to the sinking of the Titanic, because it kept the water concentrated in one area, which overbalanced it. But that you can say that after the disaster has happened. Yeah. I don't think you could have expected Andrews necessarily in his design of the ship to have foreseen what was going to happen. He was trying a new design of a ship which he thought would work. And it's the same thing with the lifeboats. I mean, for a long time, the implication has always been, they didn't put enough lifeboats on for all of the passengers. Wasn't that really evil of the management? They obviously expected to lose half the passengers and not care about it. But and I have only learnt this year with the publicity that there has been around the Julian Fellows TV Titanic mini-series that's on at the moment. The lifeboats were always intended just to ferry people to the next ship, because it was always expected that before the ship sank completely, another ship would have time to come up along board you. So you would just use the lifeboats to ferry you back and forth. It was never expected
to have to put everyone in them.
Have to put everybody in a lifeboat. So it's not really the management thinking, we don't care about half the passengers.
Their model was wrong.
Their model was wrong.
That's really interesting. Do you agree that theirs is the most interesting characters, though, or were there any other? I mean, we've mentioned the if you like the British middle class couple, or second-class couple, as it fits.
Well, they had the potential to be interesting,
They had a story,
but
weren't developed,
actually
yeah.
interesting in the musical.
I liked an individual character. Sorry, you answer first.
I liked the wireless operator.
Oh, well, there you are. See, I agree with that as well.
And I liked Etches, the steward.
Yes,
So
actually,
I
Etches the
think-
steward was very good.
They're all
it's a-
staff, though.
I was going to say, this is probably a sort of an unpopular view, as it were, because every dramatisation of the Titanic focuses on the passengers, either the rich ones being nasty or the
poor ones being Irish.
being Irish, or being downtrodden and
behind the locked
behind
doors.
the locked doors,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. But I think, given the style of the composition, it would have been much more successful if it had focused actually on the crew and the owner and the designer, and partly about the attempts after the iceberg hit, or it hit the iceberg, to
It's 6-1.
yes.
Who are we to apportion blame?
the attempts to
The jury's still out.
the attempts to either prevent the disaster or to cope with it.
Yeah.
During the 2.5 hours
Before
it sank, and we haven't even talked about the
Tastelessness of some of the comments in the programme.
Oh, well, but let's talk about the tastelessness, or otherwise, of the show. Is it right to have done a musical of the Titanic? Because it's interesting, we were talking about also numbers. Do numbers and time have an effect here? A musical about a murderer 100 years ago who kills, say, 1 or 2 people may or may not be acceptable. Listeners of Musical Talk will have heard me speaking about the Crippen musical a few years ago.
We have both taken part in one of the versions of Jack the Ripper, the musical.
And Sweeney Todd is doing great things in the West End.
Although that is
No,
purely
that's
fictional, of course,
fictional.
so at least. But the Titanic is, though not no longer in living memory in any real sense, it is a huge tragedy, and it is a resonant tragedy, as you said. Is it right to have done a musical at all? Bearing in mind, and let's talk about Oh, What a Lovely War, which I think is the show which is the nearest to how this could have been done well.
You could do it as Oh, What a Lovely War was like.
A proper concept musical.
A proper concept musical, and you'd have a lot more about the actual impact of it on not Edwardian.
Well, for all intents and purposes.
Yes.
1912 society.
Yes, 1912 society.
Edwardians finished in 1914.
I agree with that, yes.
Okay. They hadn't realised.
No.
Or I think it would be perfectly acceptable to do a story that was factual, but about, as I said, sort of how, from a crew perspective. And also, you could have done one from a passenger perspective, and from sort of the perspective of those who died, if it were done very well. I mean, I think there's a difference between whether this musical felt tasteless, or whether the concept of a Titanic musical, full stop, is tasteless. I thought with this one, it just felt, especially towards the end, where you're sort of thinking, this is obviously going to end with a big chorus number. How can they do that given the way it ends? And the
cast
answer is,
of
of
dead.
course, a reprise.
With the Phantoms of the Dead included.
Yes.
Behind the psych.
Yes. A bit of gauze. And it was actually before then. I just started to feel vaguely uncomfortable that it wasn't doing it justice. It wasn't doing the disaster justice. As you say, all these gentlemen who've waved their wives goodbye are just sort of sitting there being very stoical about it and saying, "Oh yes, let's have a game of cards," and then in a rather ludicrous bit of dialogue, which didn't even lead to an amusing song, which I thought was going to lead to a kind of a song which would either be fun or take us somewhere. They sort of basically say, "Oh, is it bad karma? Will we evil, naughty people?
Oh.
And is this?"
I thought that was the worst scene of all.
Have
The
we had that
rich
coming?
suddenly
Exactly.
argued that they had it coming, and should they confess their crimes, which obviously they'd all committed in order to become rich. And you think, what kind of nonsense is this?
This was quite an astounding thing, and so. Whereas if it had been an honest description of the attempts that were made, and there was nothing in there about, the famous, and it's an incredibly famous thing about the Titanic, about the band playing on. And this is a musical, and so they could have had something about the band actually playing on.
Particularly as there were members of the cast who were band members.
Yes.
So they were included in the story.
Yes, but they
just
disappeared.
weren't given anything to do.
They disappeared in Act 2. Also disappearing in Act 2 was the wireless operator, and I am informed by Liz that there were 2 wireless operators, so it's a bit unclear which one it was, but, you can, for dramatic purposes, combine them into one, and who, famously stayed at his post and transmitted messages from those who were about to go down
up
with the
until
ship.
about half an hour before the ship sank.
Now
Still
there was
transmitting
a
messages.
scene in Act 1 which, to be honest, was rather tedious, where he broadcasts as a favour for Stoker a fantastically long and, one would imagine, cripplingly expensive telegraph message to Stoker's beloved. And if that had been done differently, then you could have had an incredibly moving juxtaposition, and a similar scene in Act 2 where he's translating the last messages from the men who are left on board, rather than them saying, "Oh, let's confess our sins and let's have a game of cards."
Well, without wishing to cheapen this, exactly what happened in the 9/11 things. It's those last telephone messages which are the most moving aspects of that in so many ways. You've got the same equivalent.
I'm not sure that they quite the same did happen in the Titanic. I think all of the last messages are just requests for assistance.
Well, even
dramatically, you could.
What's music for if not to sort of create that
emotional
to enhance that? They're clearly quite desperate.
While we're on the wireless operator, I know I am a bit of a history nerd, and this is probably an unfair criticism, but for a musical that certainly at the beginning told you exactly how many oranges and loaves of bread were being loaded onto the Titanic, to then suddenly say, the wireless operator to say, "Oh, shall I try this new distress signal, SOS, instead of the accepted Marconi signal, which is QD something or other." It's just like, no, that isn't what happened.
Yeah.
They didn't use SOS. SOS got introduced after, although it had been invented before the Titanic sank, it wasn't used, and that annoyed me.
That felt like a pandering to the audience who didn't know that, actually. That felt exactly like something. Why aren't they going SOS?
Well, it was shoehorned in, whether or not it was
relevant or not.
I mean, to be honest, ignore it and just have him broadcasting SOS.
Yeah, you don't need to know what this... Who can read Morse code in an audience anyway?
As Julian Fellows says, who cares about the nerds? I'm doing this for the public, and the general public would expect a wireless operator to be banging out the SOS.
But talking of the wireless operator, I think actually, and by wireless operator we mean obviously the radio operator, he actually had one of the best songs in the whole piece, I thought. Unfortunately, marred by being married to one of the worst songs. So when he is sending out the message by the radio of the Stoker chap who's sending his love message, the Stoker chap has a truly boring song which goes on and on and on, but it's interwoven with the wireless operator song, which is a really interesting piece about how he was a very lonely boy and a very lonely man, but suddenly by joining in with this newfangled radio lark, which allows two-way communication with the world, he suddenly had thousands of contacts and friends and people he could talk to, as it were.
And it was a place in society.
Yeah, exactly. It was a good song, well written, and a good character piece, and relevant to the job. And so it was a good. And there weren't enough of those all the way through. There weren't enough songs that really hit the button.
It's an interesting point, and so maybe I've been on the wrong tack today. Oh, these are very sketchily developed characters. I think they were very sketchily developed characters, but it's a funny thing because you say that that helped with that character, but in a way that didn't really flesh him out.
They didn't give him anything to do afterwards.
No, they gave nothing to do afterwards, and so you could say that whereas in most drama you want your characters, if they're well drawn out, if it's a successful drama, your characters sort of have a journey. So
in this case, they went on a journey to 41 degrees latitude.
This is it. Quite deep as well. They go on a journey. So you establish what their raison d'être is, and maybe what their aims in life are, and then you see over the course of the show how they get on. Now, of course, with the fact that with the Titanic, it kind of has.
We know
what
happens.
We know what happens, and in a way, it doesn't really matter what their aims in life were, whether they survived or whether they died.
That's what it actually became about. The lottery of living.
Yes. But
I don't think it even played on that enough.
No.
Actually, the women and children first sort of is such an accepted part of our mythology about the Titanic that it was just, women and children first, and all the men are going to die, and somehow that wasn't
nobody
really
questioned
explored.
It. Not one person. Well, one person did, and then it was.
And it was done
we
off
must talk
stage.
about that in a minute. Yeah, let's talk about the big narrative where they had an opportunity for a bit of genuine drama and a bit of genuine character development, and they pulled their punch.
Yes, I mean all the way through, just everything was depicted. It felt vaguely. It didn't know what it was being. Was it a concept musical?
Was it trying to put the blame for the sinking on somebody?
Well, it was the urge to have a big chorus every now and then. And the thing was, every single big chorus, and I don't think this was just a matter of the staging for this particular production, the big choruses were all static.
Yeah.
So there was never really
it's not choreographed
apart from a dance number. No, but there wasn't a chorus number that during which a big dynamic. There was conflict over who was staying and who was dying, and
the decision song wasn't there.
No.
Yeah. Who is going to live and who is not going to live, and why, and what is the
or
criteria?
anger from the chorus. It was just another stand and sing a kind of hymn of
stoicism.
Yeah.
Stoicism.
Well, because we said earlier when we were discussing this that the thing that was completely missing was any reference really to the complete lack of second and third class people getting on the lifeboats, because the scene where the people were getting on the lifeboats was all just first class passengers saying goodbye to their wives and the husband being left behind and a couple of second class passengers getting on. We had this very small kind of named characters from the first class passengers who somehow without any explanation whatsoever managed to break through and get onto a lifeboat.
The third class, sorry.
The third class ones. But the rest of the third class passengers were not dealt with at all as soon as the boat started.
Bearing in mind they had a whole song earlier on where every single one of them stood up and said, I'm going to America because it's fabulous and I want to be, insert job profession here, dentist, street cleaner, seamstress.
A disturbingly sincere song.
It was, yes. It was.
Yes.
You made a very good point about this. Where if you, in a British off the record, which was in a British musical, if anyone says, I'm going to London or whatever because the streets are paved with gold, everyone goes, yeah, you fool. It's what it means is you're an idiot because you don't know any better. In this, it was sold that they're going to America for their better life, where it was actually said the streets of New York, I think it is, are paved with gold, and everyone, yes, they are, yes. And the song was all about, isn't America a better place? It actually said that.
Yes. We've jumped around the fact that the really interesting narrative which they completely missed, despite having set him up as one of this trio of interesting characters, is Ismay, and the fact that he survived and he, a bit like the captain of the Concordia, fell into a lifeboat.
Well, said there's a scene at the end where the survivors each do a little piece to camera and say their little bit, and he said
dire.
It was pretty dire, and his bit was, why shouldn't I have got on a lifeboat? It was only half full, and I believe that's true. There was a lifeboat that was about to leave. I can't remember exactly why, but the crew were panicking or whatever, and it was only half full, and he said, well, I'll get on it then, because why not? But why that didn't take place on stage is a mystery. As I said, all the interesting things that could have been depicted
we
in
don't
terms
see it.
of
We hear
heroism or nastiness, cowardice, or self-preservation, whatever.
And do you know what's interesting? Because I happen to know the story of Ismay. It's not even true. I mean, he did get on the lifeboat, but he actually gave himself a justification, which isn't in the play, which we've just seen. His justification was as a representative, as the most senior representative of the owner of the company, as the White Star Line, it was his duty to survive to give the official recounting of the story. That may be a load of old bunkum, but that is a justifiable position. It may not be a very strongly justifiable position, but it's better than why not.
It's justifiable in his worldview and his view of himself and his importance to the company.
Yes.
He was seen as a bit of a embarrassment afterwards, and there were actually a lot of people, because it's also the same year when Scott dies in the Antarctic.
In rather more heroic circumstances.
Yes, and heroic failure is quite a feature of the Edwardian period, and heroic failures are celebrated just as much as heroic successes. And so Ismay, by saving himself, became a bit of an embarrassment afterwards.
Yeah, whether he was right or wrong.
Whether he was right or wrong.
And the jury is out, but well, not that much out. But anyway, basically every interesting scene that we know from factual record really wasn't there, and instead there were characters that we had seen in sort of perfunctory character sketches in Act One.
One-line sketches almost.
Pretty much. I mean, to be honest, after 10 minutes of the show, where we'd had an opening number by the designer, which was sort of quite fun, and then the big embarkation, or basically the big "Isn't It Massive" scene, where set on the docks, where everyone's saying, "Ooh, yes, I'm getting on the Titanic. Ooh, yes, isn't it big?" La, la, la.
Which is actually several songs moulded into one.
Yes.
But keep going back to the same chorus.
But
I only want to mention that because it's got one section which is called "The Biggest Floating Object in the World," which I think, unfortunately, at a different level, is a fair description of the musical. Carry on.
Well, it was this huge number, and so it did go on and on, as you say. It was several numbers merged into one, and
it was the same scene repeated over
yes,
and over again.
And
I happen to be poor, but I also notice it's a big ship.
And I'm going to wave my ticket around and all of that sort of thing.
And I thought at that point, how are we going to get any characters in this? How are individuals ever going to emerge from this based on this first sort of 10 minutes? Where can the show go from here? Is it... surely
40,000 fathoms down.
Well, surely this is designed as an epic musical, which I think we would agree.
Oh yeah.
Is what it was.
It's going for scale.
Yeah, and so how can you get characters? How can you get individuals emerging from this? What on earth is it going to be like over the next?
If it's all about the macro, how does the micro work?
And the answer was that, with the exception of the bridge, in Act One, I think you'd say you just got nothing really satisfactory. You got these little character scenes which were a bit half baked, to be honest. They didn't really establish anyone, so you didn't really care. By the interval, you didn't care about anyone apart from you had a bit of sympathy for the captain because Ismay was bullying him, but there weren't many others. Yeah, pretty much. There were a couple of, as you say, the radio operator had sort of emerged with a nice little song which gave him the edge over the others. But then he never featured in Act Two at all until the very last scene.
We're back to what is the central problem with the musical, which is it tries to have too many little stories. It tries to have a first-class story and a second-class story and a third-class story and a crew story, and there's not enough time. And I never explained my tasteless comment on the programme. My tasteless comment earlier about the programme notes was, it says in the programme that this musical lasts 2 hours and 40 minutes, which is the length of time that the Titanic took to sink.
Which is a horrible thing to say.
Which is a horrible thought. It was just a really horrible thought, and I think
it must therefore, if it was anything like the show that we experienced, the very long and lingering.
Well, the thing was that it said that what it actually said was the sinking of the Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes, which is exactly the same amount of time that you will be enjoying this performance. And I thought, well, in that case, it sank like a stone.
But I just want to take us back to the point you were making about the character developments or not, and when the half-bakedness of it all, which was actually, there's very few... In fact, Captain Smith, I think, is the most interesting character in it, and he's written the most interestingly, even though there's a lot of work to be done. I think it's because his character actually comes out by what happens to him. You see how he reacts to the bullying of Ismay. He doesn't come out and say, I'm no longer going to be bullied, I'm doing this, or I will be bullied, I'm doing that. You actually see how he responds. Everyone else's character development is done through bald statement. I want to be a policeman. I'm pregnant. I'm this. I'm that. I'm something else. Everyone, they all do it that way. They say, darling, have you noticed that you own a shop and I'm a social climber? Yes, I have, darling. It's essentially that kind of thing.
I think that...
it was really baldly done.
I think the designer has a bit more as well, because, early on, just his initial song, which sort of establishes that he's would you say delusions of grandeur? He's really proud of what he's done.
Yeah, it's a one man's ecstasy, in fact.
Yes,
but ecstasy
yes,
is not
yes.
a very good judge of reality, is it?
No, but I think that he doesn't have to sort of baldly state, "I am a designer and I've designed this and whatever," or "I am very proud of what I've done." He was another of those rare characters whose character actually came out just by what they said and
the performance and what was revealed.
Yeah.
I did actually quite like this song, in a way, and it's the one that's called, I think it's the one that's called "Still" by Ida and Isidore, who are two first-class passengers, an elderly couple, and they sing this song after he has failed to persuade her to get on a lifeboat.
Oh, she chooses to die with him, doesn't she?
Aren't
She
they
chooses-
the owners of
Macy's?
Yeah.
That's it. I knew
The
they
elderly
were
Jewish couple.
elderly Jewish couple,
Rich
who were
American elderly Jewish couple, yes.
the owner of Macy's, and that was quite a. Again, it sort of does tick one of your boxes about the kind of what is expected of the people on the Titanic, that yes, there would be an elderly couple who choose to die together rather than her getting into the lifeboat and going off. But it was a very nicely done song, I think, and they performed it very well. Although I was slightly niggled by the action of crushing a champagne glass, reenacting the wedding ceremony. That was
Reasserting his vows, wasn't it?
maybe going a little bit too far.
They were lucky to get
I
champagne.
think
frankly.
actually, although they barely appeared in Act 1,
Yeah.
they had actually, through circumstance, we don't really come across them, apart from in a very brief scene, which is a bit boring actually. It's when she refuses to get on the lifeboat
that their relationship and character is
suddenly,
forged.
It suddenly comes to life for them, and so
Ironically.
then the scene that follows 15 minutes later, that Liz has just described, is actually quite moving.
Meaningful. It has worth. It's been set up.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, yes.
Because they have a sort of reason. They've been established as a stoical elderly couple
Married for 40 years.
Married for 40 years, and so they have a reason for being stoical actually.
Yeah.
Whereas the lack of drama in the second half of Act 2 was amazing, to be honest.
Yeah. You mean the human drama?
Yes. Well,
I know I am going to die in an hour.
Actually, any drama.
Yeah.
Because you have that big number we talked about called "We'll Meet Tomorrow," which was very static and was just about the women are off on the lifeboats and the men are left behind, and broadly speaking, nothing happened for about 10 minutes while they sang this very static number, which I couldn't hear the lyrics of very well, to be honest. But clearly, not a lot was happening, and it was just a sort of, this is it, bye-bye, my darling, over and over again. And then those who were left just sort of played cards or
drank a bit,
shocked the breeze, yes. And it was only that elderly couple who had any sort of reason for being the way they were. Yeah.
I also think it actually shows a mechanistic narrative failure of the second act, which is that obviously when you know so many people are going to die, particularly amongst the ones you've been introduced to, however cursorily, that there's only so many Goodbye Forever and sort of talk songs you can have. So yes, actually, we had the Stoic stuff, and then we had the couple singing their song, which we've agreed is actually one of the better songs, immediately followed by Mr. Andrews, the designer, singing his "Oh Lord, I think I've made a mistake with my plans."
Yes.
Is his kind of moment of self-revelation or self-recognition, I suppose, actually, that that he might be responsible. But of course, it's just yet another, oh my God, I'm going to die and it's all gone horribly wrong kind of story. I think it was too many 11th hour songs,
and that
because everyone had one.
He also narrated what he thought was going to happen to the people left on board, and he talked about people clinging to the railings. But I don't think that... So maybe that was meant to be the dramatic narrative of the ship sinking, but it didn't work.
The problem with the drama like that is, although it would be horrible to see, that is where the drama is. Being told about it is quite dry.
Well, that is the...
curse.
Well, that's why I'm not sure that you can do... I mean, we talked about whether it was tasteless or not, or whether the idea of a Titanic musical is tasteless or not, but
The
How do you do
Just
it?
arguably, yes.
technical difficulties in the failure to be able to sink a ship on a stage.
Yes, whether you wanted to or not.
Yes.
Whether you thought it was tasteless to depict that or not. The fact is, you can't depict it. So what do you do? And well, if you were in that situation, you might think, well, maybe you could depict it through one man describing it in horrific terms. But in that case, I think we could say, having watched it, that no, that didn't work. Now, whether that was because the music wasn't up to it, or the lyrics weren't up to it, or whatever, or just it's a doomed concept from the start, I don't know. But it didn't really hang together. But I can see, yes, maybe that was what
that could have been the
point
intention
of that
behind
song.
it. I would also, at this point, then question whether it is a musical that is worth reviving now. Since we now have the James Cameron movie, and which is out in 3D this year as well.
Well, hang on.
You got shares?
The show we saw in the theatre was in 3D.
Really?
Well, maybe not narratively, but the design had door handles on it.
And we've also got Julian Fellowes one, yet again, sorry, mentioning these. But because those are both high-profile dramas that are able to show the ship sinking.
They do, yeah.
This musical, because it's unable to do that technically,
Its whole
does it?
the waterline.
But I think that goes back to your comment, Thos, that it should have been a concept musical. It should be, if you take Oh, What a Lovely War, which we have done as an example, or actually also Jack the Ripper, the Ron Pember musical. Very sort of suspect subject matter.
In terms of taste, yes.
Yes, but it's depicted sort of via contrasting real East End life with the music hall. So insofar as you see any murders, they're done very theatrically. One of them is done through.
It's no worse than the Roger Corman film.
Well, it's done through a sort of magician and a magic cabinet and disappearing to a magic cabinet and then open a cabinet again, and instead of the lovely assistant appearing, it's a lovely assistant with
slash marks,
marks collapsing on stage. And
what an act that was.
Well, quite. And something like Oh, What a Lovely War, it deals with the First World War, but it manages it on nowhere near as lavish a scale as this particular production we saw, and I'm sure that there's no way you could do that musical of Titanic without doing it on a lavish scale. But it gets all that stuff across, and I think the only way to depict on stage the sinking of the Titanic is through a sort of concept-driven thing, where you're depicting it sort of figuratively, you're looking at it in terms of the impact on other people, wider society, etc., etc.
I think, actually, something you said earlier, before we started recording, which is, what is it about? Oh, What a Lovely War has got a point. It is actually saying something about the First World War. The problem with Titanic the musical, and indeed the Titanic situation in general, is the fact that it's not about anything, because it's actually an act of God. There's been many an attempt to create posthumously and retro villains in the piece, but essentially it's a drama for every single living person on that ship, whether they survive or not. That is a horrible experience. No one will want to go through that. And mistakes may have been made, but no one did it deliberately. It is an act of God. So there is no point.
Well, so
it can't be about anything.
Well, it can be either a sort of historical narrative, or at least just depicting how people coped.
Yeah.
In which case,
how does everyone face adversity?
Yes, and really, everything that happened in the first half up to when the iceberg is struck is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because it's about what happened to those people. Yes, you might want a bit of explanatory stuff about who these people were, because there might well have been examples of, nice people acting like bastards, or evil people suddenly
finding
doing
God,
acts, finding God, or behaving selflessly, or whatever. We don't know. The thing was, it just didn't. That would have been a valid approach to take, but we didn't get any of that. We got
everyone did what they were expected to do.
Well, yes, because suddenly,
and it was just too much a historical narrative just about the voyage of the Titanic. I think, Thos, you have hit on a really interesting point about all of the commemorations of the Titanic this year, which is very, very infrequently do they actually deal with what happened to the survivors afterwards and the bigger impact of what it did. I don't know what impact it did have on shipping, or the way the White Star Line was seen afterwards. Did it end up like American Airlines after 9/11, which American Airlines collapsed?
Yeah.
It was not American Airlines' fault that their planes were used to fly into the two towers, but people
But it
would
was a
not
fact,
fly
it
with them
was,
afterwards. Did the same happen to the White Star Line afterwards?
Well, it's not with us in a way that Cunard, who were almost mentioned,
Yes, indeed. So maybe it did collapse in the same way. You know, what happened to the people who survived? And that would have been a very interesting musical.
Well, it would have been the thing was that there was just nothing really in it, because it wasn't a sort of factual depiction of what happened, because I don't buy any, I think that the claim is that a lot of the characters are based on fact, but I don't think we know much about what those people did. I hope they didn't act as boringly as they did in the musical in real life, because
This is not a fitting tribute to them.
well,
if it
no,
is.
that's the thing. That's a crucial thing. We watched it on. This is the centenary day.
Yes, it is. It's the actual day.
The actual day
hit the iceberg.
hit the iceberg, and towards the end, it just felt a bit cheap to me.
It's the old Tommy Cooper joke, isn't it? Any news about the iceberg?
Well, we've said how technically a musical, or certainly this musical, cannot show the ship sinking on stage, and you cannot show the actual physicality of the ship breaking up and all the rest of it. And so, as well as Mr. Andrews' vision, the song, they also had The Foundering, which was a set of spoken dialogue, one of the very longest stretches of spoken dialogue in the musical, with no music underneath it, which is something we touched on briefly, that there was most of the time dialogue was spoken over music, which was a couple of sentences spoken by various characters describing the sinking and the people who were in the lifeboats and hearing the cries of the people in the water and so on. And it didn't work. It really was, certainly for me, it just didn't work, and it felt like a recitation of facts. It didn't make the story...
This is the saying something is sentimental and emotional makes it emotional and sentimental, which
Yes.
of course doesn't.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a lot to be said for narrative descriptions.
Yeah.
They can
Up
be
to a
incredibly powerful. Well,
Yeah.
I think the thing is not at the end of a big Broadway musical.
Particularly a spectacle music.
A spectacle music, exactly.
Yes.
Again, it's just the wrong kind of show.
And that it's actually at the end of both acts, their musical style is broken compared with everything that has been preceding it.
Well, that's interesting. Go on.
Most of the musical is quite narrative, and it's songs, and it's just telling you the story as it goes along in incredible amount of depth about what happened when people were sailing on the Titanic. Suddenly, at the end of Act 1, you have the look up in the crow's nest, and there have been some quite interesting little ensemble or this collage type singing going on, with people promenading on the deck and getting lit up in the spotlight and saying, "Oh, what's going on?" and talking about Macy's. This is when we were first introduced to this elderly Jewish couple. But then suddenly, all of the cast gathers on stage and starts singing about it being a dark moon-free night, and all that it's very cold and there's icebergs up ahead. And it completely changes it, because how do they know? What are they doing up on deck at that point, wandering around going, "Oh, it's very, dark night tonight, can't see any icebergs. Oh, but why would they even be looking for icebergs?" And it's just wrong, and it broke the style of all of the songs and the story that had gone beforehand. And this bit at the end of Act 2 does the same, because they're not in character any longer. They're just...
It's very odd, that,
It's
isn't it?
very odd, and they're just reading lines about what happened.
It's almost as though you could see that in a film where if you've really been going for broke about people drowning and dying in front of you, but you cut away to a factual, like you sometimes see in war films where they just cut to a solitary voice remembering somebody or something like that, and that can be very effective. But I agree, it absolutely wasn't in this, and you hadn't seen that.
No.
The threat of death, bizarrely, just wasn't included.
No,
was it? It just
no.
wasn't there. They die, but they're not in no way in a threatened.
I mean, all of the passengers were sort of last seen either leaning over the
Rail of the ship,
rail in a contemplative
smoking
fashion.
their cigars.
Yes, indeed, yes. Or about to have a game of cards.
Or walking the deck, having a glass of champagne.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, I said that was the Macy's couple who, we'd established that does make sense actually for them, because they had decided to be together. So it would make sense for them. It just goes back to, they would be stoical, but the others, just what on earth was...
Because you see, the thing that annoyed me about that, it is the equivalent in a movie of having the screens up with text on to explain what was going on. Is it threw in all kinds of random statements about things which had not been able to be touched upon in the musical. So there was somebody saying, we could hear the voices of the people in the water crying, but the lifeboats wouldn't go up to them. And the next person said, it was because we were worried we would be swamped. And actually, that's quite an interesting story in itself.
That's horrible in its own right, isn't it? Yeah, these people weren't prepared to put themselves out.
And or they were so terrified that they would be swamped if they got too close.
Oh, I speak that way too, yes. But neither of those were investigated.
Neither of those. No. It was just chucked in as a statement.
That is an example of show not tell. I mean, difficult to achieve maybe, have a lifeboat, but then again they managed to wheel on the wheel. And, the bridge.
In Phantom of the Opera, a man rose himself on stage.
Yes,
so of course it's possible.
Yes, but this wasn't a West End production.
No.
It was a very slick production, but so yes.
But the narrative wouldn't have allowed for that anyway. They didn't have the debate, so there would have been no need for the lifeboat to be on.
No, but I mean, but there should have been.
Before we go, I would just like to talk about the score a bit more. What songs were successful, not necessarily in narrative terms, but just as songs? I'm going to pull one which is both successful and unsuccessful, which we've mentioned before, not on the recording, but when we were coming here, which was, there's a song called The Latest Rag, because in 1912, rag was coming in, it was the newfangled new music, and on the Titanic were 8 bandsmen, who formed a quintet and a trio for most of the time, except on the night of the disaster where they formed for the first time a group of 8 and went down with the ship playing, essentially. But they had a group, the White Star Songbook, basically. They had something like 300, 400 songs, which they all knew, and they were a mixture of old operetta songs from the Arcadians, the Pirates of Penzance, and some of these newfangled rags coming in. So we get, which as a composer I'd have thought would have been a really exciting thing. Not only was this happening as a human interest story, but you've got a pushing of 2 different musical cultures occurring at that very second in British in Western history. And we get one rag song in the entire piece. It's quite a jolly little rag song, although it's the version we saw today was staged in a slightly 20s style rather than of the period. But more to the point, it was absolutely superfluous to the plot. Absolutely. It was a lovely little song which you could have pulled out and nobody would have noticed.
It was superfluous to the plot, and it was superfluous to the score as well. Had the whole score been...
A bit more raggy?
Well, a bit more raggy or just a bit more varied.
Yeah.
But so, all the choruses were big numbers and...
The Les look, as you were saying, yeah.
Yes.
All of the solos were big canbelto numbers as well. And there was the exception we had of the sort of slightly GNS or early 20th century musical number 4 for Etches, who I would also say was about the best written character in the show.
Etches,
I would say.
Yes, I agree with that. Nicely portrayed as well in the version we saw.
Well portrayed, nice bits of dialogue, but the only one who didn't have lame dialogue. Some of his jokes were actually funny, in other words.
Yes.
And the odd nice little musical number. So there was that, and then a bit later there was the rag thing. For me, the song sung by Etches wasn't so out of place. It was a bit out of place, but it sort of felt okay. Whereas the rag one just it felt like, let's lob in a number where the chorus move about.
And a few of them did.
Yes, and again, well, we talked about the band playing during the sinking, and so again, if you're going to bring in the band, bring them properly. Either don't have the band, in other words, cut that number, or have the band and make that. It just was another sort of lob it in, and then it's another instantly forgettable.
Well, I must say that there are records about what was the last song played by the band originally on the Titanic, and some people say it's Nearer My God Than Thee or whatever, and some other references are to a song called Autumn Waltz. And we get in the score a song called Autumn, which is actually a very nice song. It's about Shall We All Meet Again in Autumn, which, of course, given the resonance and the context, is supposed to be meaningful. I quite like the song, and it's clearly there as a nod to the people who know that Autumn Waltz is at least allegedly the last song or was played that night. But it isn't the original, so it's not a jukebox musical. It's a brand new song. I quite liked it, I have to say. There was another song I quite liked a lot, by the way, as well, which was, I think it was Dressed in Your Pyjamas in the Grand Saloon. I don't know why I liked it. I just quite liked the idea that everyone was being pulled out of their cabins. It wasn't it wasn't so much the context of what they were doing. I just liked the song, actually. It was quite a jolly song. So there were moments of the score I quite appreciated.
Yes.
But it didn't add up to a great anything.
It was
good and
as
bad.
we said at the beginning, very symphonic all the way through.
How very Vaughan Williams.
How very
I think if I listen to this,
I think the thing it felt most familiar or most similar, to me, is Les Mis, where it's just big music all the time, and you had a recurring theme that was starting to come up.
The leitmotif of the Titanic,
yes, all the time.
A very heavy motif.
And yeah, none of the songs really stick in my mind, except for the other one that we've already mentioned, the wireless part of the song he sings with the very boring. Yes. Which I thought was very good.
Yes,
I think if I listened to the score now, I would appreciate it much more. But I think you and I, Thos, in fact, all three of us, are quite narrative-driven in our tastes in musical theatre.
This discussion has proven that.
We like things to sort of have a point, and
cohere.
I get basically to cohere. And however nice a musical number is, if I'm being fantastically irritated by
other stuff
going on, I find it hard to appreciate it. I think there were some. Yes, there were definitely some very nice numbers there. I think all the numbers we've just identified had merit. Some of them, catchy.
Not that many, though.
No, not that many. But as I said, just the impression I got from this one viewing was that things like the rag number sort of were just plonked in there for the sake of having a dance number, because it's a musical, so we really ought to have a dance number. It didn't really feel it went anywhere. I mean, insofar as there was a band on the Titanic, yes, let's have a band number playing the sort of music they would have played. But as you say, if they were going to do that, then it could have been a slightly more rag-infused score overall. I'd have to listen to it again to really form a view, but it didn't really feel like it cohered, but that might be less the music's fault than the narrative's fault.
And while we're talking about the lyrics as well as the music, I did find, this is going back to the tastelessness thing as well, the fact that the number that was reprised at the end includes a line, "Sink or swim, Titanic sails on." I just found incredibly tasteless.
And the last part of that, inaccurate. Well, I think what we've got, in a nutshell, and I think between you've summed it up perfectly, lame dialogue, Les Mis music. But I don't think there's any more to be said about the Titanic, the musical. I'm sure many people will love it, and indeed it ran for 2 years on Broadway, but conversely it's never had a professional British performance.
I can understand why, and I think that's very wise.
I would not invest in it.
No.
So all I can say for the moment is, Liz, Jerry, thank you so much for joining me in this journey of a lifetime, which has ended slightly better than that of the show that we saw this afternoon. So thank you very much, and speak to you again.
Thank
you.
Musical talk. Well, there we have it, Titanic the musical. Unfortunately, in our view, not actually a very successful musical, but I think that's very clearly due to the book. There's nothing particularly wrong with the score, and indeed it's got a lot of nice stuff in it. But we did mention several times in that discussion the actual band that was on board. And so I do think it's worthwhile, just briefly, talking about those brave men, 8 of them indeed, all of whom perished as the ship went down. And there's been such a great deal of folklore created about them, because it turns out it's a true story that they played as the ship went down. The whole idea of the band played on comes from this event. The band was led by a man called Wallace Hartley, and indeed he is one of the characters represented in the Maury Yeston musical. He had a long career of working for, funnily enough, the Cunard line, which was the principal rival to the White Star line, on its luxury liners, as a band leader. However, he accepted a pay rise and, of course, an increase in prestige that came with working on one of the world's greatest ships for Titanic, and went over to the White Star line, although he was never actually employed by them, because there was an agency process. The same was true of the other 7 members of the band. But they were treated very well. They were actually treated as second-class passengers, and so got splendid cabins, not the most splendid, but certainly very, very plush to the modern eyes, and free food, of course. Now, it's important to remember that although there were 8 players on the ship, they were in fact divided into 2 groups. Wallace Hartley was the leader of the band overall, but he played with the quintet, which generally played at tea time, in after-dinner concerts, and on the Sunday services. But there was a small trio of violin, cello and piano that played in the reception room outside the à la carte restaurant and the Café Parisien, which is where the first-class passengers generally congregated. And these two little groups, if you like, didn't get together. They worked separately and independently of each other. And it's generally thought that when the announcement that the ship was starting to sink and Wallace Hartley brought all 8 performers together to perform together, it was the first time that this had happened since the ship had left Southampton. Nor was the band entirely British, because it included a violinist from Belgium called Georges Crins, probably better pronounced Crans, Krins, and a cellist from France, Roger Bricot. The rest of the group included John Woodward, John Clark, Theodore Brayley, John Hume and Percy Taylor. There's a very interesting article on the website www.titanic-titanic.com under the Titanic's band. And so I'm going to quote briefly from that. The names of the band were permanently inscribed into the history books on the night of the 14th of April 1912, and their totally unselfish deeds during that night serve as a constant reminder of the devotion to duty many people displayed during the sinking. Shortly after midnight, as the lifeboats had begun to be loaded, Wallace Hartley assembled his band in the first-class lounge, where many of the first-class passengers were now assembling, and began to play. Many people later commented on how strange it was to be wearing a life jacket awaiting orders to get into the lifeboats whilst the band continued to play away as though nothing had happened. Later, as more and more people began to realise the seriousness of the situation and began to file onto the boat deck, Wallace Hartley reassembled his band, taking it away from the first-class area, and reassembled it on the boat deck. You have to remember this was freezing cold in the middle of the night with ice everywhere. And so the band played its final gig, if you like, on the entrance to the grand staircase. What the band played as the Titanic slowly began to sink is never disputed. They played ragtime, which of course was an incoming kind of music at the time, waltzes. Specific tunes noted by survivors included Alexander's Ragtime Band and In the Shadows. Also, it's known that they played extracts of the Arcadians and the Pirates of Penzance earlier on in the trip. But of course you may know there is a question mark over what the last song actually played was. It's generally stated to be the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. However, there is actually eyewitness evidence to suggest it was a song called Song of Autumn. And it's interesting that in Maury Yeston's adaptation of the Titanic disaster, his musical, there is a song called Autumn, which is clearly there to represent that last song. And sadly, all 8 members of the band went down with the ship at 2:20 in the morning on the 15th of April 1912. And particularly interesting is, just as I was recording this final comment, it's been announced that the violin of Wallace Hartley, alleged to be the one that he used on the Titanic, has come to light in an auction house. Apparently the violin has clearly been damaged by water, although it's thought highly unlikely that a violin would have survived. As it was, Wallace Hartley's body was discovered in the sea a fortnight after the ship went down, and so he was returned to Britain and buried in a village called Colne near Liverpool. And many of his belongings were found on his body, although the original itinerary of the things found with him when his body was recovered does not include a violin. So the instrument in question has been sent for analysis to see if it has been in salt water, which I think is an interesting little coda. Well, it's been quite a long episode, and in some ways a little negative. That's unfortunately because we didn't enjoy Titanic the musical, but that is not in any way to denigrate the appalling and yet amazing story of the Titanic, its resonance in society even today, and of course how that resonance has been reflected in musical theatre over the last 100 years. But I'm going to close this episode by thanking you for listening and dedicating what you've just heard to the 8 bandsmen who died on the Titanic. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented and edited by Thos. Copyright Musical Talk 2012. And now for some musical out talks. Second class, a level, if that's okay. We're going to speak of that. Maybe Jerry first. Could you hang it off hang it out for a minute?
Yeah, I'll hang it out for a minute or two with pleasure.
Well, it's rare that the warm-up goes straight into the outtakes, but Jerry, would you care to say something?
I would care to say something, yes. Here I am saying something of great depth and import.
Splendid.
Hello, I've finished my chocolate, so I can now talk.
That's all very good, and I'm over here, so I'll probably have to do a little bit of wobbling, but that's fine.
You wobble
That's
away.
okay. I'll do an in-studio link because it's always easier if that's okay. Allows me to show off at home. And write a musical based on the style of music of Vaughan Williams. Believe it or not, yes. I may have revealed my hand. This game of poker isn't going as well as I thought.
That's because there's a card shark at the table.
Yeah, I think yes. Oh, clever reference, me like. I would like to make a couple of points then. There's one song, I think, halfway through the first act, which is sung essentially by the chief steward, Etchings, and much of his...
Etches, I believe.
Oh, Etches, I'm so sorry.
Say it again.
There is one... I will. No, you're quite right to correct me, and that will be... Yeah.
I've been looking at his
Etches.
etches.
Time out.
Yeah.
Whereas an awful lot of the other musical numbers reflect that.
It has to be said, though, that I think the wireless... I thought... But thank you. But I thought that the wireless... I can cut that out, you see, which is why I can still afford to be polite. You pour away, love. Go on. Sounds like one of us has wet ourselves halfway through the show.
Somebody has to. Right.
Thank you. We'll never know, as they all died, haha. But now that's how to do tasteless, you see. I wouldn't actually necessarily believe that. But there we are. I'm just giving our listeners a view of what it could have been like.
But we
Now that may be a load of old bunkum, but it is just yes.
which, as it says in the programme, this musical lasts 2 hours and 20 minutes, which is the length of time that the Titanic took to sunk.
Do you want to say that again?
Shall I say that again?
And it was all going so well.
2 hours 40
I think you'll
minutes
just have to leave that in now.
Do you want to have a second batch of it?
You'll just put it in the outtakes anyway.
Might appear again in the best of compilation. Who knows?
Whether you want to or not.
So, we shall let those rest in peace in the Titanic because they are blessed in one way by not having heard the musical. So we will. I can't use that. It's like when the chap who wrote, the Bernard Cribbin song "Hole in the Ground."
Yeah.
And Wright said, when he died, we made a reference to he's in a hole in the ground. We had to cut it.
Yeah.